After an unfortunate hazing incident, a sorority president aims to protect her power by ordering her stepbrother to seduce the daughter of the Vice President of the United States. At the Delta Phi sorority house, the members practice their welcome presentation for Caroline and Lucien, their future president. However, CC tells the women that their welcome presentation isn't good enough. Moments later, Caroline arrives after her boyfriend, Rower, drops her off. CC brags about her rush plans, but the women remind her of the lingering optics issue from last year's spring formal. 3 months ago, Lucien Belmont, Caroline's stepbrother, strolled into the spring formal, then sneaked off for a steamy encounter with Beatrice Worth in the bathroom. Meanwhile, CC bombarded him with messages, but he ignored them and returned to the party after the intimate interaction, where he smoothly picked up Kate. Beatrice also tried to enter the exclusive party, but she was stopped by 2 ladies because she wasn't on the guest list. Concurrently, Blake Powell pulled Lucien aside and hinted that he wanted to do the deed with a man. Then CC joined them and discussed her plans for the upcoming election with Blake, revealing the calculated steps she's taking to ensure victory. Suddenly, she saw Rower with Jenny Davenport, Caroline's main rival for the presidency, so she alerted her friend. Eventually, Caroline asserted that she always gets what she wants, sparking tension between her and Lucien and leading to an argument. CC stepped in to defuse the situation, pointing out that their only real issue is the alliance between Rower and Jenny. Later, Caroline found her boyfriend watching the spring formal hazing ritual, which was much more brutal than they anticipated. While the pledges endured the horrifying ordeal, Scott Russell got hit in the head and collapsed on the spot. As chaos ensued, Caroline realized that the incident could ruin her carefully laid plans of becoming president. In the present, Rower faces questions about his whereabouts during last year's spring formal. Dean Sheffield begins interrogating those who might know anything about Scott's injury, focusing on uncovering any illicit hazing activity that might have occurred. Meanwhile, Congressman Russell, Scott's father, presses the issue, asking why there have been no consequences. But Scott claims he remembers nothing, which only deepens the mystery. Sheffield announces that all fraternities and sororities are on probation until someone is held accountable, and that the campus police force will be doubled, especially with the vice president's daughter arriving soon. Outside the school, the congressman is asked if he'll back federal anti-hazing legislation, and he vows to work with the administration to ensure that no student suffers like Scott again. Concurrently, Claudia Maito has a private conversation with Lucien in the car, discussing his future and their next moves. She touches his legs and admits that although she's his stepmother, she's always been drawn to him. After dropping him off at the Delta Phi house, she immediately leaves while Caroline tells CC about Annie Grover, the vice president's daughter. Lucien appears and removes his clothes, prompting the stepsister to tell her friend to leave the room. As the man takes a bath, she tells him about Annie, but he seems uninterested. So, Caroline confesses that she wants the new student for herself because she believes the school won't abolish the sorority if the VP's daughter is a member. The woman asks her stepbrother to convince Annie to join the sorority. He wonders what's in it for him, so the stepsister promises that if he convinces the student to join Delta Phi, she'll finally sleep with him, since she's aware of his attraction toward her. When Annie arrives at the school, she recognizes Lucien and smiles at him. Meanwhile, Professor Hank Chadwick greets CC with confusion as he notices her looking at the items on his desk in his office. She introduces herself as his new teaching assistant and points out that he's the only professor with a lecture size of over 100 students without a TA. The man insists he doesn't need one, but CC convinces him by promising to cut his workload in half, so Professor Chadwick agrees to give her the job. Concurrently, Blake and Scott lay down on the bed after making love. Then Blake shows him a logbook of written stories that he can't let his lover read until he trusts her completely. He adds that they could use it to track down the person responsible for the hazing and make them pay, but Scott says it doesn't matter because he doesn't remember anything from that night. While Annie talks to her mother on the phone, Lucien approaches and tries to introduce himself. Her security guard, Sandy, steps in to stop him, but Annie says it's all right. However, she points out that the man has quite a reputation and firmly tells him she's not interested in sleeping with him. Meanwhile, Caroline confronts Rower, who promised to stop by but never showed up. When she demands that he admit what he did to Scott last year, Rower denies everything, but Caroline says she's no longer willing to cover for him. The woman worries that they could lose their chapters, and she can't stay silent anymore, but her boyfriend doubts she has anything on him. Irate Rower tells Blay that he wants Caroline kicked out and banned from the house, but his girlfriend interrupts. She accuses him of hurting Scott, and to his surprise, his friend sides with the woman. When Lucien arrives, Rower demands the key to the safe, expecting it to be his ticket out of this mess. However, when he opens it up, he sees that the book he's looking for is missing. Furious, he attacks Lucien, so Caroline calls campus police to the Alpha Gamma house. Eventually, campus police break up the fight and take Rower away. Scott begins to piece things together, and realizes that the man was likely the person who threw the beer can at him last year. Later, Lucien talks to his stepsister about Rower's downfall, and says she can have Annie if she wants her. Then CC reveals that the new student didn't show up for Sigma yesterday, which is good news for them. However, they worry that things might get worse because of Beatrice's article painting the sorority in a negative light. So Caroline tells her stepbrother to use the writer to get to Annie. Meanwhile, in Annie's room, Beatrice explains how the Greek system works on campus, how the groups run the school, and how some are worse than others. Then the new student sees Lucien waiting for her outside and decides not to approach him. She asks her friend what she needs to know about the man. Before a delayed event, Caroline meets with the members and explains that tonight's vote will determine who gets an invite to the sorority's president's night. CC starts reviewing the candidates, many of which Lucien has been involved with, adding more tension to the mix. During Annie's turn, CC and Caroline are surprised when she gets a unanimous vote to receive an invite to President's Night. Days later, Caroline answers a call from Claudia, who mentions that Rower's father and half of his constituency pulled out from her massive work event after the brawl at the fraternity house. So the daughter promises she'll fix everything by getting Annie on her side. After the call, the stressed Caroline snorts an illicit substance that she keeps inside the cross around her neck. Meanwhile, Annie and Beatrice arrive at the new political society event where Ella and others debate social constructs. The woman introduces the new student to the members, and Rye mentions that although he doesn't agree with the vice president's politics, he respects that Annie is her own person who has her own views. Concurrently, Caroline finds Lucien hanging out with Blay and Scott. She tells him that she needs a strong partner for President's Night, and insists her stepbrother bring a date. The woman states that she doesn't need a date because all she needs to secure is Annie and her influence. While walking along the campus, CC spots the vice president's daughter with a political group and immediately calls Caroline. Meanwhile, Annie doesn't seem completely convinced by everything the group is saying, especially their talk about taking action against the Greek houses. Beatrice suggests they could get her uncle, who works at Time magazine, to push the story even further. Concurrently, Caroline confronts Lucien, asking him to deliver Annie to her. Then she brings up his past with Beatrice, warning him not to disappoint her. She stresses that the new student is their key to security, and warns her stepbrother of the serious consequences if he fails, such as her taking his car. After the woman leaves, he calls someone to ask for a favor, realizing just how much is riding on his next move. The next day, CC thinks that Caroline should choose a new man to date, convinced it will help her reputation, but the latter disagrees because she's more focused on Annie. In her room, the new student finds numerous messages from Lucien, along with a stack of invitations, her curiosity growing as she ponders his persistence. At the Alpha Gamma house, Blake casually calls Lucien Mr. President, and Brian joins in, reminding them that he's vice president. Later, Lucien gives Annie a gift, a fake ID under the name Cassidy Featherstone, a gesture that leaves her intrigued and more drawn toward the charming man than she expected. He tells the new student that he enjoyed their time together the other night and believes she did as well, but he's confused by her sudden coldness. He insists that he has more to offer and tries to convince her to give him another chance. In an attempt to win her over, he promises to do anything she wants on President's Night, so Annie cautiously asks if he's willing to go along with her plans. Meanwhile, Blay visits Caroline to inform her that a news crew has arrived, preparing for the big night. CC also lets the woman know that the vice president's daughter is on her way over. Caroline steps outside to address the gathering crowd, declaring that tonight will mark the beginning of a new era of leadership. Suddenly, protesters calling for the end of Greek houses arrive. Despite seeing Annie and Lucien siding with the protesters, Caroline stands firm, signaling her unwavering commitment to the night's events despite the mounting challenges. The next day, CC reads an article stating that Annie's involvement in the protest has fueled the anti-Greek movement. Caroline brushes it off as fake news, reassuring her friend that she's got everything under control. She gathers the members of Delta Phi, but in a fit of frustration, she destroys her phone before storming out. Meanwhile, Beatrice talks to Annie, praising how well things have gone for them. She adds that the new student impressed people, though the latter seems troubled by the article's backlash. Lucien approaches, and after the friend steps away, the vice president's daughter opens up about how she thought the article was supposed to help but now people are criticizing her. The man tries to console Annie, saying she's too concerned about what others think and suggesting that she needs to focus on herself. Concurrently, Caroline speaks to Blay about Scott becoming Alpha Gamma's next president. She acknowledges that the man could be a useful asset to their plans, and after he agrees to help, they begin strategizing. He mentions Brian, Roar's former VP, as the only other candidate, but insists Scott will win the election by a landslide. Later, Lucien confronts his stepsister about changing his approach, expressing frustration with her controlling nature. Caroline reminds him that his rebellion was just an act and mentions the stakes if he doesn't fulfill her demands. In a private moment, Blay takes advantage of Scott's vulnerability, performing an intimate act in exchange for him running for Alpha Gamma's presidency. Still unsure, the man asks about Brian's involvement in the race. Determined to secure the election, Blay takes matters into his own hands and visits Brian in person. He orders Brian to step down from the election, whether he agrees with the decision or not. However, the man makes it clear that he's worked hard for this position and desires the power, title, and benefits that come with it. Blay brushes him off, stating that the decision is no longer in his hands. Meanwhile, Annie attempts to call her mother, only to be interrupted by Lucien in the library. He tries to show her that he doesn't care about the consequences, urging her to stop worrying. However, the woman insists on talking to a reporter to clear her name, but he quickly points out that speaking to the press will only make things worse. Despite her frustration, Annie reluctantly agrees to trust Lucien. Concurrently, Beatrice excitedly takes a call from a reporter at the Manchester Daily who wants to shadow her during the New Political Society Symposium. Elsewhere, CC and Caroline discuss the upcoming events. Blay interrupts the pair with an update on Brian, who still refuses to drop out of the election. He suggests that only a woman's touch can handle this situation, and he needs help exposing the man's flaws. Caroline tells them to coordinate with CC, though the woman initially resists, as she has to help Professor Hank Chadwick. However, Caroline insists that the professor isn't worth the time and that she needs to do it for the sorority, and she eventually agrees to help. Later, Lucien and Annie head to the store to buy liquor and other items. The cashier asks for the woman's ID, putting them in an awkward situation. The new student uses her fake ID, but the cashier recognizes her as the vice president's daughter, so Lucien quickly claims that she is just a lookalike, and she adds more details to make his fabricated story more believable. Meanwhile, CC visits Brian to try and gather dirt on him. After the strange interaction with his member, she calls Blay to report that the man is well endowed. Blay tells her to improvise and figure out a way to use this to their advantage. The woman returns and tries using ice to make Brian's member appear smaller. Later, Lucien convinces Annie to swim with him. They jump into the water and briefly have fun until an alarm sounds, signaling trouble. Panicked, they grab their things and run away with smiles on their faces. Concurrently, Blay uses an incriminating photo that CC discreetly took to blackmail Brian, demanding that the man drop out of the race. He promises that if he does, the photos and rumors will disappear, adding that every Delta member is willing to tell everyone that he's well endowed if he cooperates. Because of fear of humiliation, Brian announces that he's stepping down and shocks everyone by endorsing Scott as his replacement. At the New Political Society event, Beatrice speaks with Ollie Dunbar, a reporter from the Manchester Daily. She tries to get Annie to share her story, but Lucien reminds the woman that actions speak louder than words, referencing their previous success in ruining President's Night at Delta Phi. Later that night, Annie and Lucien attended the anti-Greek life protest, and they join the group as they make their way to the Delta Phi house. To everyone's surprise, Caroline welcomes the protesters, including Beatrice, so the crowd enters the house and enjoys the champagne and food they prepared. Later, the woman approaches Lucien and Annie, offering the new student a chance to start over and enjoy the party. As soon as Beatrice gets in the house, she complains to the reporter about the money that the sorority uses for these kinds of events. Caroline overhears the comment, and says she is always welcome to enjoy the festivities, just like what she's doing right now. The sorority president also subtly reveals that Beatrice participated in last year's rush but didn't have the chance to join the party because she wasn't on the list. Ollie picks up on this detail, piecing together that Beatrice's actions may stem from personal resentment, since she wasn't accepted into Delta Phi. Enraged, Beatrice accuses Caroline of being pure evil and attempts to rally the crowd to leave, but no one follows her. She also talks to Annie and says they should leave together, but the vice president's daughter apologizes and says that she wants to stay a little bit longer. When the reporter asks the new student for a comment, she says she doesn't have anything to share for now. Caroline steps in, switching the focus to Scott, announcing him as the new Alpha Gamma president. Then Blade takes over the conversation smoothly, ensuring control of the narrative. Cece approaches Annie to casually ask for her details, hinting she might be a future Delta Phi recruit. Later, Lucien congratulates his stepsister privately, but she quickly reminds him he still hasn't fulfilled an important part of their deal. Meanwhile, Brian watches Blade and Scott from a distance, his suspicion growing as he observes their interactions. As the night winds down, Caroline watches Annie leave with Lucien, intrigued and eager to see if her stepbrother can pull off the plan or stumble. Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.